everyone. Thank you for joining me for this new episode of Carolyn Talks podcast slash YouTube channel. I'm your host, Carolyn Hines, film critic, journalist, and podcaster. And today I am joined by two filmmakers to discuss their film Move Me. I'm joined by Kelsey Peterson and Daniel Klein. And as usual, before we begin to discuss the film, I'm going to ask both Kelsey and Daniel about how they came to work together on the project. Because looking at Daniel's bio, like your trajectory from being a chef to doing food documentaries to making a film like Move Me, it's pretty interesting. And for Kelsey, just like your story, I have MS, I have multiple sclerosis. So watching films about people with disabilities is always something emotional for me. And this one touched me a lot. So I'll begin with Kelsey. Can you talk about what inspired you to actually make this documentary and how you became connected with Daniel?
Wow. So yeah, this documentary started out very different. The story that I aimed to capture about finding a cure for spinal cord injury shifted a lot. The story wasn't really there. And it was a very different time in my life. I was only 5 years post-injury. And so I really wanted to capture what was happening for a cure. But we kind of realized that that wasn't the story that needed to be told, that wanted to be told. And so things shifted very much onto me, and in a very intense and vulnerable way. And at the same time, my life had shifted a lot. Some really big things were happening with the clinical trial and a cripples dance, and my dad had gotten sick. And Daniel and I had reconnected as soon as kind of when all of this stuff started happening. So it was kind of divine timing in that way. And he was the film partner that I really needed in order to do this well. So I was really grateful for that. I am really grateful for that. I wouldn't have been able to do this without him, honestly.
And for you, Daniel, how did you connect with Kelsey? And just talk a bit briefly about your trajectory, as I said, from chef to food documentaries to this documentary.
Sure. So back in 2005, I made my first feature-length documentary with no experience, and that film was about the failures of food aid in Africa. I took on a very ambitious project without knowing much at all. And while I was editing that film, I started to work in restaurants, and I fell in love with cooking and food. And so that's where I went down the cooking chef path. My dog is scratching at the door, sorry. That's where I went down that path, and kind of wanted to merge my passions.
Just let Frankie in. She's like, Dad, I need
you.
It's
a Chihuahua.
She's a little Chihuahua terrier, right? She's so cute.
For those listening, I suppose there's now a dog in the interview too. Anyways, I had a passion for food and for social justice and for film, and I combined those things into a documentary series called The Perennial Plate that I worked on for a lot of years. And I promised I would never make another feature-length film again because it was so hard the first time and took so many years. However, along comes Kelsey, and I think we just started to form a nice friendship as I gave her little bits of advice on filmmaking. And over the course of probably like a year of becoming friends and giving small bits of advice, I saw how I changed personally, kind of the perspective that I gained about my own ableism, and also saw, Kelsey's fierce vulnerability as a great character potential for a film, and her desire to make that film. And so it just sort of like happened. It wasn't like a moment or another, but we sort of started working more and more until we were both, working full time on the film. So it was a very organic process.
The thing for it, as Kelsey, as you mentioned, this is a film where you get very vulnerable and very open about discussing things like intimacy and your sexuality as a woman before and after you became paralyzed. But one of the things that I think really strikes me, and that I hope viewers, especially those who are not disabled, take from this film is the patience that disabled people have to have for our own selves. We have to have a lot of patience for our bodies and for our limitations. And like some days, like some things are harder one day than they were the day before. And it takes so much patience and so much willpower and grace for us to be able to adapt to whatever new limitation occurs for us in our life. So can you talk a bit about that part of the film? Because I hope that's something that a lot of people realize, because like it's being disabled is not, to say it's not easy is an understatement, but it takes so much out of us, I think, emotionally and mentally. So just talk a bit about that.
Yeah, you kind of nailed it with all of those subjects. I think this whole process, like, I really came into my own as a woman with a disability. I wasn't at this level of loving myself and loving being a disabled person. And that's still something that I think it'll always be evolving and growing and something to work on. Like, there are moments that I want to get out of this chair and throughout the day, and I have good moments and bad moments and good days and bad days, like you said. Um, but this film was really this like little container for healing and transformation. And I think it really became that because I felt like I could do that in this space. Like, I felt safe and held by this team. And it gave me permission to feel comfortable and be authentic and be vulnerable and go through some healing that I really, really needed. It was such a gift in that way. I also knew that my sexuality has always been something that I've loved about myself, and I didn't want to hide that from anyone. I didn't want to hide that from myself. I knew there was a lot of discovery that I wanted to do there, and I didn't want to hide it from our audience and what that could potentially do in terms of changing a narrative or bringing healing to the disability community, the spinal cord injury community, and the larger collective. Like, I think as both as a woman and as a person with a disability, that was really important to me to share how sexuality is a human right, and so removing that, like desexualizing us as people with disabilities, is in and of itself dehumanizing. And so it was really important to me to be as transparent and vulnerable about that as I could be. And this team helped me do that.
Yeah. So there's something that you said in the film that kind of touches on that. You said it, and then like it's something that you never really brought back, but I think it says so much about being disabled, especially being a person who uses the wheelchair. There's it's a scene when you're going to meet Gabe, and this is the first time we're introduced with Gabe, and you talked about how the chair is basically an emotional barrier between you and the people that you care about. And a lot of people are going to think of wheelchairs are as a physical barrier, because like it does like in a way prevent you from getting like physically close to people, because we see like with Gabe, when you're hugging him, you can't embrace as close as you want to, because your chairs are literally creating a space. But it also distances you emotionally from the people you're close to. So explain that from your own perspective for anyone who might not necessarily be able to understand exactly what you mean. I get it, but could you explain that?
And it separates you from people who you could potentially build a connection with, because a lot of people automatically, we have such an ingrained ableism culturally, and that it prevents us from, there's this like fear and this stigma that prevents us from feeling comfortable connecting with each other. And I get it. My own internalized ableism has been revealed big time, and it still is. Like, that's 27 years of my life, and being able-bodied, and I'm only almost 10 years in. I'm like a second grader or third grader, whatever that is, in terms of like understanding what it means to live with a disability, and working through my ableism and the ableism that is constantly coming at us. But that's been one of the hardest things about becoming disabled, is seeing how now there is this hardship that you have to endure that a lot of people who love you don't understand. And It takes a lot of work for them to understand it. It takes a lot of work for me to understand it. And I'm the one living it. And so the people who love me and are close to me, if they don't work to understand what this means and to create some empathy surrounding that and figure out how they can show up, it just keeps creating barriers, and that's really sad and hard to deal with. It's been at times devastating. But then you have people who do show up, thankfully, and who try to learn, and it makes all the difference in the world. But it's work.
Thank you so much for sharing that. It's a learning process. I think every day as a disabled person is a learning process. Like we learn so much about ourselves, and we have to learn so much about the world that we're inhabiting and the space that we live in. And like we learn so much about how the world is accessible and how it isn't. Like simple things like using the spray can that you were trying to think, like companies, people who develop these things don't think about the needs of disabled people. And for you, Daniel, like as the observer, because you are working as an observer in this film. So talk a bit about your perspective. Like you talked earlier about contending with your own ableism before and during the process of creating this film. So talk a bit about the observer of how people interacted with Kelsey and like just like observing her in spaces, because I know like just going down the street, like people will like look and like not necessarily think that looking is considered ableist, but it's all about the way that they're looking at people who are in wheelchairs. And just you can tell when people are having specific thoughts, and like you're like, I know you're having a thought you shouldn't really be having right now. So Daniel, talk a bit about that, your perspective as the observer of that.
Yeah, I mean, my being an observer was part of what made me want to make this film. Becoming friends with Kelsey, having not had a disabled friend, enlightened me to my ableism, and it became very clear about so many things. Kelsey's a great friend to have who's disabled because she's so unafraid and is willing to share with you to sort of, bring you up to speed. And the process, I'm still not there, but was helpful for me. And one of the reasons to make the film was also to bring the viewer on that journey as well, and kind of for them to see beyond the chair, as he put it, like through the discussions of sexuality, through showing a few of the moments where people, unbeknownst to them, are ableist. There's a moment in the doctor's office where a nurse who's very kind decides to ask Kelsey about her. The most horrible thing that happened in Kelsey's life, it wasn't her job to ask. She didn't need to know, and yet she did because of ableism. And so finding those little moments were important to the whole team. And also showing really how Kelsey has to wait in the morning for someone to come help her get out of bed. And showing a bit of the monotony in the film was really important to me and Nico Frank, our editor, who is a core member of this team and super important in the writing and production of it. Those are some moments that Kelsey didn't necessarily think we needed to include, but for us able-bodied people, we saw that it was important to see, and we hadn't seen that before, and we needed to live through some of that, or not live, but view through some of those moments in order to really have the challenges sink in.
So I know we're running down on time, but there's something I just have to ask, and it's about the use of water and theme. I thought it was, as someone who loves the water and loves the ocean, and I've always had the fear of something like what happened to you, Kelsey, happening to me, because I've dived off of piers. I've jumped off of piers into the ocean, and as I'm going down, I have to think, I'm like, Carolyn, what are you doing? And because about these, how these things, how life can just change in an instant, which is, as you do say, that's legit how you begin the film. That you do talk about how your life changed in an instant. But while what happened to you could have made you afraid of the water, I love how you use the theme of water and of it holding you as being a place of healing for you as well. It's a place of you to learn to accept yourself and accept your body as it is now. So talk about that, because I was just to me, that was one of the most profound things. I'm like, instead of water becoming a place of fear for you, it's now a place of healing and acceptance.
Right. And it feels so good. Aside from that, like it feels so good to be in the water. You know, that I can move more in the water. It's the only time I'm out of my chair and not like there's no pressure on my body. I get to have so much more freedom to play. And it can be a little scary, but there's still that level of fear and lack of control there, but and vulnerability. But I think including that, having that theme of water in the film was really like about this theme of being like water, like how can water is so strong and it flows and it finds ways to get where it needs to go. And I think it really drove home this theme that I needed in my life of surrendering to the flow and using that to adapt and love myself again.
Great, so much. I love what you said about be water, because that's something Bruce Lee always used to say. He talks about be water, which is a place of moving and accepting, and like finding new places and avenues. So I love that you said that. And
I'm just trying to be a ninja.
Like we all want to be ninjas. And also there's like the vulnerability of showing your body, not only in the dance and the movement, but just like getting ready in the morning. There's a film that I watched and I spoke to the director about it, called 37 Seconds. It's on Netflix, and it's about this young woman who has cerebral palsy. And that was also the first film where I saw a young woman, her body being shown as not something to be afraid of and not something to be ashamed of, but it's like showing like the sexuality and the sensuality of female body in all forms. And your film does the same way, where you're just like openly vulnerable and showing like the vulnerability of your body and like who you are. And you're just like showing like I can still move my body, I'm still sensual, I'm still a dancer. So thank you so much for being open and about that, and for creating the film. And I hope many people see it and they pay attention to what you're saying, and not just I hope they really take the lesson, because I think the film is a great way of showing people like this is how the world is, like very casually ableist, to people who are disabled. And like it does, and it's a learning process. And as I said, it's about patience. So thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you so much for speaking with me. And hi to your little dog.
Again.